and compliance, why are they important to the co-op and its employees? My name is Brian Munson. I'm the Director of Membership Development for NCBA-CLUSA, and I will be your moderator today. Our panelist on this webinar is Bill Erlenbush, Director of Education at National Society of Accountants for Cooperatives. Before we begin, just a quick bit of housekeeping for you. Participant phone lines will be muted during this presentation to reduce background noise. That said, we do encourage you to ask our panelists questions. So if you have a question, please type it into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. We will answer your questions as time allows toward the end of the program. The second thing is NCBA-CLUSA will be recording this, and so it will be archived on our website. You will receive an email containing a link to the posted recording sometime early next week. This particular webinar is third in a series of educational demos presented by NCBA-CLUSA and our associate members. Associate members of NCBA-CLUSA are service providers with a defined expertise, and the aim of this series is to really help co-ops navigate certain business challenges that are common to all the sectors. As one of these associate members, NSAC offers accounting, auditing, tax, and business education uniquely tailored to co-ops, along with networking and professional development opportunities for its members. The organization has also served as a unified voice to help shape tax provisions that impact the financial decisions of cooperatives. The focus of today's webinar will be to outline what motivates ethical and honest behavior, the definition of ethics and compliance, why cooperatives need compliance programs, who is responsible for the success of a compliance program, and outlining some of the elements of a successful compliance program. I'm now going to turn the webinar over to Bill, who will enlighten everybody to just a little bit about his background, and then we'll get started. Bill?
Thank you, Brian, and thank you all for joining the webinar today. My name is Bill Erlenbush. I'm retired from Growmark, Inc., which is a regional cooperative marketing and supply co-op in mostly in the Midwest, although we operate in about 20-some states. I was with the co-op about 40 years. The last 18, or of the last 20, 18 were spent as the controller of the co-op, and then the last 2 years were spent as the compliance director. Growmark's compliance program, and I'll talk a little bit, I'll reference it as I go through here, but was established in 1998. At that point in time, we determined that it was necessary to show our members and customers that we were an ethical and compliant company, and it was just becoming standard practices. So it was established in 1998, and until 2009, basically the director of compliance was a part-time position. The first director of compliance was a fellow who was pretty quiet and well liked by the employees, and he kind of became known as Father Bill. If you did something wrong, you went to Father Bill, confessed, and he set you straight and sent you on your way. The second compliance officer, part-time compliance officer, was in our legal department, and he kind of became known as Sheriff Dan. He kind of took a different approach. If you did something wrong, he was going to hunt you down and prosecute you. And then as Growmark added a lot of retail establishments, it was determined that we needed a full-time compliance officer, more in terms of education than in hunting people down. So that's when I left the controller's position in knowing I was going to be retiring in a few years, and became the full-time compliance director. So that's kind of my background. I've been involved in compliance since then, and even in retirement I get involved in a little bit. But you know, compliance and ethics is kind of a it's an environmental thing. It's what's the environment of the co-op that you're working for. I think most employees are honest and forthright and want to be that way. Things like compliance programs and internal controls kind of push them a little bit farther in the right direction. As we look at compliance, Deloitte did a recent study that talked about compliance percentages. So next slide there, Brian, as we go. Basically, and this is all companies, not just co-ops, but 50% have a full-time compliance officer, and that's the kind of emblematic of the priorities being put on compliance in today's world. 33% feel compliance is viewed as a business partner across the organization. And that's one of those percentages that needs to go up, because compliance area needs to be looked at as a partner in the organization, not as the policeman of the organization. 23% do not measure the effectiveness of their program. That number seems low, because how do you know your program's working if you don't measure the effectiveness of it? And 18% are confident or not confident in their IT system's ability to fulfill compliance requirements. So that's kind of like saying, what kind of internal controls do we have built into the IT system? And it sounds like a lot of companies aren't real confident in that. Next slide, please. Deloitte identified the top 4 responsibilities of compliance, and I would totally agree with those. 87% of the people with compliance program felt that it was there for training purposes. You know, you can't hold people responsible without telling them first what the rules are and what the expectations are. 84% of the respondents thought that a code of conduct was one of the top 4 responsibilities. And once again, this is the type thing where you almost need a formal code of conduct, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of what the rules are and what the expectations are. 81% felt that the compliance function was to handle complaints and whistleblower hotlines. And finally, 80% felt that it was to deal with domestic regulations. So really, compliance is dealing with 2 different things. One is compliance with domestic regulations, as it states here, but the other is the behavior of the employees and that type thing. Next slide, please. When you see this triangle, if you're in accounting, you recognize it as the fraud triangle. If an employee has motivation and has an opportunity, they will do something illegal or unethical, and they can rationalize why they do that. But in terms of ethics, this could represent fraud, sexual harassment, illegal activities, or a host of other compliance issues. As I said, if there's an opportunity, an employee will rationalize it and go ahead and do it. Next slide, please. Ethics and compliance are not mutually exclusive. They complement each other, and a good compliance program promotes ethics and good ethics within the organization. And good ethics within the organization makes compliance more effective. If you take a look, ethics is really the set of organizational values and principles, and it provides guidelines and decision-making in the absence of the prescribed rules or policies. So it's kind of the employees knowing what's right and what's wrong. Compliance, on the other hand, is a more formal approach. It's the organizational structures, business processes, and internal control environment that's set up within the company. It fosters adherence to laws, regulations, and company policies. Compliance programs need to be transparent. They need to be integrated into the organization, not something that sits alongside the operations of the organization. And they need to have dedicated resources, such as a compliance officer. Next slide. What is compliance and ethics? Well, compliance is really the appropriate behavior when there are rules. That's when you have that code of conduct that explains to the employee what they need to be doing and this type of thing. Ethics, on the other hand, is appropriate behavior where there are no explicit rules. What do you do when no one's watching? I always talk to employees and say, would your mom be proud of what you're doing? If she is, then you're probably doing the right thing. But sometimes compliance and ethics are considered to mean the same thing, but they're not the same thing. And the difference is, as I said, people's behavior when there are no rules versus rules. Next slide, please. So why would a co-op want to focus on ethics and compliance? Well, first of all, it's required by the law. If you take a look at the U.S. federal sentencing guidelines, you see that if, for example, if a co-op were ever convicted of a federal law, the sentencing guidelines provide some leniency if a co-op or the company, the offender has an effective compliance program. Sarbanes-Oxley and the SEC rules also state the need for compliance programs. While co-ops aren't subject to Sarbanes-Oxley and SEC rules, those are the people who set the best practices and something that we all need to ascribe to. It's also good business to have a compliance program. It can result in higher quality information, process optimization, and better capital allocation, and improved effectiveness. Because you're not, your employees aren't, if you have good compliance and good ethics, then you're not spending your time trying to track those down and finding the offenders and that type of thing. It also protects the co-op's reputation as well as it reduces costs. Next slide, please. So what are the negative consequences of not having a compliance program? Well, it's that reputation that we talked about, and we'll talk about it a little bit further later, but there are negative reputational and financial implications. Enforcement actions are taken against the organization if you don't have a compliance program, as I mentioned in the federal sentencing guidelines. You have greater exposure to corruption risk because the environment of the co-op is such that it's not telling the employees, having safeguards against that. And there's the lack of oversight and awareness to proactively manage the risk. We talk a lot about tone at the top, but that tone at the top has to be very specific and very clear, because depending on what middle management thinks of that, the rules are enforced or they're not. And then it ends up with buzz at the bottom where the employees don't know, they're getting mixed signals. They're not sure what's the proper thing to do. The other thing, by not having a program, employees don't know how to report wrongdoing, and that's really the biggest prohibitive factor in things, in violations of compliance and ethics, and that is the employees reporting them, because they're the ones that see it and know what's going on. Next slide, please. So what is a compliance program? For a compliance program to be successful, both the employees and the management must buy in. Both parties must realize the importance of a compliance program. And for management, it's setting the expectations of employee behavior, and for the employees, the acceptance of the rules and a commitment to follow them. So management has a responsibility of putting that compliance program into effect, but it has to be one that the employees are going to buy into. As one of my favorite quotes in the compliance area is that policies don't create cultures, leaders do. So once again, you've got to have that commitment from the top management to have a good compliance program and to have a good control environment. Next slide. The purpose of a compliance and ethics program is to ensure the business is conducted legally, ethically, and in a manner to protect the well-being of both the employees and the company. So it's a program that's set up not only for the company's protection, but also for the protection of the employees. An ethics and compliance program sets the organization's expectations regarding that ethical and compliant behavior. Next slide. If you were to take the results, if you have a good, effective compliance program, there's just 3 words that tells you that. It's when the employees do the right thing. They know, based on the environment of the company or the co-op that they're working in, they know what the right thing is to do, and they do it. Most employees know right from wrong and want to do the right thing. They just need a gentle push to make the right decisions, and a compliance program is that tool. Next slide, please. If you look at the guts of a compliance program, this is a little bit of a busy slide, but a good compliance program structure begins at the top with management and the board of directors. The board of directors has to be the primary proponent of this. Management may bring it to their attention, but they've got to make sure that management and the employees get the understanding that it's very important to them. So management and the board of directors put into place a corporate ethics and a compliance program, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But then within that compliance program, it includes, as I mentioned earlier, board oversight and management responsibility. There are written standards and procedures, that code of conduct that I talked about. There's ongoing risk assessments. Where is the risk? Where might things go wrong? Where might employees do the wrong things? And then there's the, setting up controls and this type of thing to stop that from happening. There's the communications and training, letting the employees know what's expected, training them in right from wrong in terms of proper behavior, that type of thing. There's the monitoring and auditing process, and once again, you're monitoring what's happening. As things are getting reported, you're looking to say what safeguard was missing there that we should have had. The incident reporting processes, you need to keep track of those and make sure that they get handled through corrective action and discipline. And all of that's based on the laws, rules, regulations, and conventions of the individual co-ops. It's the importance of what the environment there is. Next slide, please. If you take a look at this triangle, you can kind of see the things that we've talked about. You know, the foundation of the triangle is the control environment. As we, see a compliance program helps create this environment by, you guys have all seen companies, whether they're either tightly run with good controls or they're loosely run, and that control environment sets those standards. The control, a code of conduct within that compliance program helps with the risk assessment, helps to identify the risks of the gaps in the organization, and it prioritizes them so that the co-op spends the right time identifying and controlling the priority risks, the big risks. Control activities include an effective compliance program because they develop an action plan to mitigate these key risks. As I mentioned, monitoring is the type thing where you've got to stay on top of things and monitor the effectiveness of that compliance program on a continuous basis. And then, of course, information and communication ties it all together. You need, when you hire new people, make sure they understand what the expectations of the employees are, what the expectations of management is. You need reminders of the code of conduct and the different policies that are included. And there needs to be an ample amount of time spent training employees on the compliance program and what's ethical and what's not. Next slide, please. A typical compliance program is made up of two elements. One, you have the code of conduct, which is a set of rules and regulations set by the company as to how they want to run the business and what the expectations of the employees are. That code of conduct is really the cornerstone. As I said, it sets the rules. Key elements in an effective code of conduct include easy access and understanding. Can the employees read it and understand what it says? Does it clearly communicate the culture and the expected behaviors of the co-op? And it sets expectations for conduct. It says, what the employees can and cannot do. It communicates the values of the co-op. It, sets up to the employees that they're working for a good company that values the employees and values doing things the right way. It addresses key risk areas. Within the code of conduct, you want to speak to the employees about different risk areas and how they should be doing things. And it also provides information about anonymous reporting mechanisms and the process there. How do you report wrongdoing? The compliance procedures are the second part. Once you've got the code of conduct, and the compliance procedures are really the operational side of compliance. It provides employees with understanding of the code of conduct and the incorporated areas. So, how should they do it, that type of thing. Next slide, please. The compliance program itself is sometimes code of conduct are rather long and hard to read and easy and understand, especially if you're legal department or you have a legal department write it. You have to try to eliminate the legalese out of that so that the code of conduct is understandable to the employee as they read through it. Some organizations create a compliance summary, which is an executive summary of the compliance program, hits the high points. It's easily read and provides guidance in the areas that the company feels it's most important. But this summary can't be substituted for the entire code of conduct. The employees need to be familiar with it too, and they need to have read it on pretty much an annual basis. And finally, the compliance program is all-inclusive. It covers all employees, management, board of directors, or any person conducting business as an agent of the company. So it applies all the way through the corporation. It's just not for the base employees. It runs all the way through the board of directors. They're expected to maintain that ethical behavior and this type of thing. Next slide, please. The roles of various people within the co-op are important. They all have to do their job in order for it to be a successful compliance program. The board of directors have to be informed about the overall strategy, risks, and content of operations, and they have to provide reasonable oversight. They have to be involved. There have to be reports to them on how the compliance program is working. Senior management's role is to provide the leadership. They ensure that adequate resources and authority are there in order to maintain the compliance program and to promote ethics, and it helps to cultivate the culture. they're the ones who determine who the compliance officer should be and what his role is in the cooperative. Next slide, please. The role of the employees is multifold. Most companies provide required annual compliance training for employees, covering such subjects as antitrust laws, sexual harassment, protection of assets, and operating legally. At Growmark, we contracted with an online firm that provided that type of training. Employees were required to log onto the system, pick a subject, and watch the videos and do a short quiz at the end. And these went anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. And employees were required to take 4 of these courses during the course of the year. They could do it at their time whenever they wanted. And of course, it was always interesting. Our year end was August 31st, and how much the system was used as August as these type things got done, because the employees were held accountable for it. They sat down with their supervisor for their annual review, and one of the things checked was did they do the proper training? Did they get all their training modules done? Also, employees were asked to sign an acknowledgement each year that they conducted themselves in an ethical manner. That was once again to bring into focus for them the importance that, in my case, the Growmark provided, or the importance that Growmark put on being ethical and compliant. And that served as the focus to make sure that was happening. So as I mentioned, those were the 2 things that got covered as part of that year-end performance review, was did they do the training, and could they sign the performance review. Obviously, when people have to sign their name, they kind of take things a little more seriously as to whether they've been ethical and compliant or not. Next slide, please. Another role of the employees is to they need to understand that they're violating the code of conduct if they ignore breaches of ethics by fellow employees, because the code of conduct says it's the employee's responsibility to report any wrongdoing that they sense. Most employees consider this snitching, but in fact, reporting is required. Employees are also protected by whistleblower laws that state that an employee cannot be retaliated against by management or fellow employees because they reported an infraction in good faith. And we'll get into what good faith reporting is a little bit later. Next slide, please. And finally, the role of an employee is cooperation and investigation. Employees are required to cooperate with the conduct of any investigation into a suspected violation of the compliance program. This includes being truthful and forthcoming regarding any requests for information. It may also include assisting in an investigation. For a compliance program to be effective, employees must cooperate in investigations. They need to understand that it's a violation of the code of conduct if they don't. And finally, a strong corporate culture provides employees with the confidence and protection to help with the investigation. If they report something and they're not discriminated against, or they're not held as a snitch because they were doing their job, that kind of helps promote that and gives the employees confidence to report that type of thing. As it said in the Deloitte study, 50% of the companies have a compliance officer. That'd be the next slide, please. And the role of that compliance officer is important, and the management reporting relationships have to show that. In most cases, the compliance officer reports directly to the CEO, but he has the ability to communicate directly with the board of directors if necessary. And that's an important criterion for that compliance officer. Everything, if he runs something through the CEO and the CEO doesn't take action, the compliance officer has the right and the ability to go directly to the board of directors and know that he's protected in doing so. Obviously, the compliance officer has to use discretion when he does that. It can't be on everything, but it helps the CEO understand what his role is in this whole thing. The compliance officer really is one who implements the program strategy, puts it together. He makes the day-to-day decisions, and he reports periodically both to the CEO and the board of directors. At Growmark, every time my role as the compliance officer, I reported to the audit committee of the board. in every audit committee meeting, I would do a report to them explaining what types of violations we had and what the investigation resulted in, and what discipline was taken for. Didn't get into a lot of details because that's the type of thing that the board of directors, for their protection as well as the protection of the employees, don't need to know all the details. But they were given kind of an executive summary of what happened and how it was handled. And that was done, as I mentioned, every audit committee meeting, and then I put together an annual report. Next slide, please. The role of the compliance officer, in a little more detail, is responsible for assuring the proper operation of the compliance program. He sets those compliance procedures, how things are done. He's responsible for the education of the employees, determining how the employees are to be educated and to the magnitude of that training. He's a resource for questions. If an employee has a question about whether something's ethical or not, I always told the employees in the training sessions that rather than do it, please ask first before you do something that you think may be questionable. He's responsible for doing the monitoring of the and the investigating if there's any reporting done. And he's the contact for reporting those compliance concerns. The compliance officer, while he is kind of a standalone guy, he has support from other areas such as HR, legal, safety. While they may not report directly to the compliance officer, they're at the compliance's disposal to help in the compliance program operation. Obviously, the compliance officer is not held responsible for knowing all the rules and regulations and in terms of employment or safety issues or environmental issues, that type of thing. So he has the ability to access these other departments for support in that regard. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit more, getting into what's in a code of conduct now. Many compliance programs identify the primary focus of the program. In the following example, there are 4 aims or pillars that are identified in the Gromart Code of Conduct. One is that we want to protect, there's a section on protecting the co-op's assets and integrity. There's also a section on the protection of the welfare of the co-op's employees. So, this is the part where the employees understand that the Code of Conduct is for their benefit too. There's also a section on the prevention and detection of conduct, which is illegal and could lead to legal liability. And finally, then, the final section is prevention and detection of conduct, which is unethical or unsafe. Next slide, please. There are a lot of policies. Co-ops, as well as regular corporations, have a lot of policies that can be assimilated into that Code of Conduct, not necessarily become a part of it, but be referenced. And these are some examples of that. Obviously, most co-ops have an antitrust and trade regulation policy. There's usually an environmental health and safety policy, which talks about how the environmental regulations are to be followed, or the OSHA type conduct, that type of thing. Conflicts of interest, obviously, employees need to understand that there is such a thing as conflict of interest. There's the electronic assets policy, business contracts policy, who's allowed to sign business contracts and to what level they need to be. So all of these additional policies can be folded into the Code of Conduct or referenced by the Code of Conduct, therefore effectively making them part of the Code of Conduct. Next slide, please. We'll look at a little bit more detail of each of these sections, 4 sections that I just talked about. The first aim or pillar is to ensure that the cooperative's profitability and viability by protecting its business reputation, the assets, and the financial integrity of the co-op. Next slide, please. One of those most important part of a compliance program needs to be to protect the co-op's reputation. The co-op's reputation, much like your own personal reputation, can be considered really its most important asset. Your customer's perception of the organization can spell the difference between success and failure. And as we all know, building a reputation can take years, yet it can be destroyed by a single action or a wrong decision, this type of thing. So the Code of Conduct puts in place, or puts before the employees, the importance of that business reputation and how they should work to strive to maintain it. Next slide, please. There's the protection and safekeeping of property. The Code of Conduct contains references to the protection of cash, physical assets, and intellectual property such as formulas, logistics, and operating procedures. So it's kind of telling you, if, not to the detail that you need to lock the door every night when you go home, but to keep in front of the employees the importance of safeguarding those assets and making sure that they aren't stolen or abandoned, this type of thing. And then, there's also things such as trademarks and logos and customer lists. Employees need to understand that those are important too to the co-op, and that a salesman, when he leaves, can't take that customer list with him to the competitor. That belongs to the co-op. Kind of give you an example of where we had a situation where we had a violation of this policy, or this section of the Code of Conduct. We, at one of our fertilizer facilities, we had a manager kind of go into business for himself using the co-op's inventories. He went out and dealt with some farmers and told them, that if they placed their orders through him, he could consolidate those into a larger order and get them some quantity discounts. And so some of the farmers did that. They placed an order with him rather than with the office at the location. And he would then deliver the product to them. A lot of that product got delivered after hours. And then when it came time to pay, they paid him. And obviously the co-op had the internal controls in place, looking at shrink and that type of thing, but they never could figure it out. And what happened was the manager had a medical emergency and was off the job for a while, and some of the farmers came in and wanted to know who they should place their orders with now that he wasn't there, so that they could get that discount. And that kind of raised all kinds of red flags, and that's how the co-op found out about it. It wasn't they would have eventually caught it through the investigation of shrinkage and that type of thing, but it's an example of how things can happen and how it gets caught, not because of the safeguards, but because of physical illness or that type of thing. Next slide, please. The Code of Conduct is also specific in what actions are not allowed or considered violations of the Code of Conduct. For example, illegal or improper use of company assets, accepting gifts from vendors, customers, or competitors without the knowledge of the company. We'll get into that a little bit more in gifts and gratuities a little bit later in the presentation. It's illegal to create a secret company fund or an asset. False or misleading entries are not allowed to be made into the books. And then finally, there's that kind of catch-all phrase, any conduct detrimental to the co-op or its employees. So once again, you're putting in front of the employees what's acceptable and what's not. Next slide, please. In the electronic assets and communications section, it's important in warning employees that anything done using a company computer or a network is subject to employee privacy policies. So anything the employee puts on his computer, it's not that the company is going to monitor and come in at night and check his computer and see what's on it, but if there's ever a compliance violation and the computer's involved, the company has the right to take that computer and go through all the files to see what's there. The employee doesn't have the right to say, well, these files are the company's or the co-op's, and these files are mine, so you can't look at those. If it's done on the company computer, any information on there belongs to the company. We've had an example of where we had an employee running a side business using the company computer. It was, there was no conflict of interest or anything, but he was using the company computer to generate invoices to keep track of the accounting and that type of thing. And obviously, that's not allowed under the Code of Conduct. Next slide, please. One of the things that happens a lot is intellectual property gets the copyright laws are violated, this type of thing, and not on purpose, but just because the employees don't know any better. They don't understand the copyright or trademark or other intellectual property laws, or in most cases they don't even think about them in their daily activities. Well, the Code of Conduct has that reminder that you can't duplicate magazine articles or other printed materials. That's a violation of copyright laws. Now, probably we've all done that, but the proper thing would be to route that magazine rather than make copies of it. But those are the type of things that we know they're probably going to get violated to a certain extent, but we want to make sure that employees are aware of it and that there's no major violations of that type thing. So that's kind of the end of the part about protecting the company's assets. Next slide, please. The next slide the next section deals with the protection of the welfare of the employees. And a well-written code of conduct protects not only the company but also the employees. And this section states that, and I'll give you some examples of that. Next slide, please. One of the probably most violated rules is harassment and discrimination when you look at the type of things that employees may do. It's important that employees understand the definition of harassment, and a good code of conduct spells out what is sexual harassment. Obviously sexual harassment is any unwelcome sexual advances. It's any verbal or nonverbal actions of a sexual nature. Exposure to electronic communications such as email, instant messaging, and that type of thing. Those cute little cartoons or jokes that you get that deal in a sexual manner probably shouldn't be forwarded on. They should probably be just deleted from your computer to put an end to that. Exposure to printed materials of a sexual nature. Obviously, those of us who have fertilizer plants and this type of thing know that the employees sometimes have calendars and this type of thing in their setting in their shops and this type of thing and on the walls. It's kind of interesting. I was giving a training session and I mentioned that part of my early sex education growing up on a farm was going to the welding shop with my dad, because the guy there had all kinds of calendars on the wall and this type of thing. And as I was saying that, a gentleman from the back of the room says, well, does this mean I need to take all my calendars down? I said, yeah, I think you do. But, it's also physical contact of a sexual nature. It's request, quid pro quo, where you're requesting sexual favors in order for advancement or a promotion, that type of thing. And the creation of a hostile work environment. That's one where it's an atmosphere that makes employees uncomfortable in the workplace. We had a situation at one of our retail locations where the office manager was continually harassing the employees, not so much in a sexual manner, but just continually criticizing their work, just kind of making a living hell for the employees working in that office. And one of the employees was bold enough to give me a call, and I met her at an off-site location, and we talked about it. And there was enough evidence there in talking with a couple of other employees that this office manager was doing those things. So we brought the office manager in. You never do these type of things in front of the employees. So we brought her into for a discussion. As we talked through it, she seemed to understand that what the situation was, and that she realized what she was doing wrong. Well, apparently we found out from another employee a few days later that she went back to the office and just ripped into the employees. She indicated that there was a mole in the office that was telling stories on her, and she was going to find out who it was, and they were going to pay for it. Well, needless to say, we don't need an office manager that has that type of an attitude. And so she was released. That was probably one of the more worst things that can happen. I mean, this was a situation where it led to discipline, including termination of the employee. Next slide, please. We also want to prevent harassment and discrimination. We need to tell the employees that. And that's spelled out through the employee guidelines included in the code of conduct. We talk about discrimination of any kind is not acceptable. Harassment is not acceptable. And we have the standard wording in there regarding employment that shall be based on reasonable factors other than race, sex, age, religion, or any other factor protected by law. And that's to two things. One, it's to let the employees know that the company's culture is not going to allow that. And two, it's to put in writing what the company's responsibilities are should there ever be a problem we've got that in writing that says we understand what that was and that we aren't going to do that. Next slide, please. Privacy is important to the employees. You know, the co-op has all kinds of information on the employee. It has, you know, name, address, social security number, birth date, names of children, name of spouse, that type of thing. And the employees need to know that the co-op respects that privacy and that it's going to safeguard that privacy to the extent that that it's in, you know, to the best extent of the co-op, and that's important to the employees to know that that's happening. Next slide, please. There's also the protection of the welfare of the employees. I mentioned a little bit earlier about environmental health and safety policies. You know, the goal there is to protect the environment and health and safety of the employees. You know, things like safety, required safety equipment, that type of thing. There's a anti-workplace and violence policy in place that it's not allowed. As a matter of fact, we had some operations in Canada, and the laws in Canada are a whole lot stricter on that than they are here in the U.S. You have to do an annual report to the government indicating what you're doing to prevent workplace violence from taking place. Obviously, there's the alcohol and drug-free workplace policies, as well as the Safe Driver program. We, on an annual basis, all the employees who drove company vehicles or vehicles on company business, we did a DMV check of their driving record each year to make sure that we weren't missing any DUIs, that type of thing. And you know, once again, it's important that this be communicated to the employees so that they know what the expectations are and what the co-op's going to do. The third section is of a good compliance program, deals with, I'm sorry, next slide, please, deals with the compliance with the law and prevention of legal liability. You know, the co-op is stating that in the code of conduct that they're going to conduct business in compliance with the law, and the employees agree to conduct themselves in that same legal manner. Next slide, please. You know, the code of conduct is very strict in saying that all employees must obey the law, and they have to refuse to participate in any activity that is believed to be illegal. And as I said earlier, if they ever have any question, that's what the compliance officer is there for. Please ask before you do it. Next slide, please. Antitrust is a big issue, not only with co-ops, but all businesses. They're complicated. The antitrust laws are complicated and can be unintentionally broken. It's important for employees, especially employees in sales, to have a basic understanding of what's legal and what's not. We typically, every 2 years, put on a seminar for all of our salesmen, making sure they understood what antitrust laws were and what violations were. For example, within the Code of Conduct, we've said that an offense for 2 or more persons that agree to limit or restrict competition, such as fixing prices, allocating markets or trade territories, you know, getting together with a competitor and says, you know, we'll do most of our business in the north half of the county if you restrict yourself to the south part of the county. And also, you can't tie products together. For example, in the seed corn business, a lot of times there's a shortage of a certain variety of seed corn. Well, you as the co-op can't say to the customer, if you buy 10 bags of this variety that's not so popular, I can get you 5 bags of the popular type. That's a restriction of trade. You can't do that. You know, we talk to the employees about what to do if they believe they are in an antitrust situation. For example, they may be at a industry meeting or something like that, and we tell them if they find themselves in that situation, they don't stay and listen. Just excuse yourself and move away from it. Then when you get back to the office, please tell your supervisor what happened so he can report it to top management. So that way, if management ever would happen to get a call from the Justice Department asking about it, management knows that it happened. They talked about what steps were taken, what the employee did, that type of thing, and that may eliminate a lot of time spent dealing with investigations and that type of thing. Next slide, please. We also make sure that employees understand that antitrust laws are enforced by various federal, state, and municipal authorities. And if they get a call from any of these, please refer them to the company's legal counsel or refer them to management. So don't necessarily cooperate immediately. Make sure that that you're, as an employee of the company, you're represented by legal counsel, because a lot of, keep in mind that as we tell employees, that the investigators are not your friends. They're out to get you in the co-op, and we want to make sure that that while we're truthful in everything, that it's presented in such a way that we don't raise more questions or create misunderstandings that we have to spend a lot of time straightening out later. Next slide, please. Okay. Doing business in a legal sense means that there are certain legal relationships, and there's a protocol for developing those relationships. And I think probably the key thing out of this is that we want to make sure employees understand what they can commit the co-op to and what they can't. It may be different for the location manager to sign a copier lease, but he may not be authorized to sign a lease of anhydrous trailers or nurse tanks, that type of thing. And it's important that they know what the limit of their authority is. Next slide, please. Obviously, bribery is not allowed anywhere. That the employees need to understand that they can't take bribes, nor can they make bribes. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not to be conferred with gifts and gratuities, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Next slide, please. One of the last things regarding the legal type things is employees need to understand what whistleblower protection is. Employees have to know that they're protected from retaliation or discrimination because they reported a code of conduct violation. But they have to do that in good faith, that the employees must really believe it is a violation. Whistleblowers, and it only protects the employee in the instance that they were not party to the action. In other words, it's not an amnesty card that you can play if you were part of the incident, and now you're going to turn, quote, as we've seen in the movie State's Evidence. You're still responsible for what you did. It doesn't protect you in that regard. Also, employees sometimes think that because they were a whistleblower, the company can't fire them for some other violation. Well, that's not entirely true. If you report something and then you steal in a later type steal things, you can be dismissed, you can be disciplined. But the employees need to understand to the extent that whistleblower protection goes and exactly how it deals with. Code of conduct does that. The final piece of the code of conduct is states that the company's employees will operate in an ethical manner, and it expects its employees to do likewise. Next slide should be political activities and contributions. One of the things that employees need to understand is that in most cases the co-op do not support political candidates. The co-op may make contributions to a political action committee to further a cause or seek favorable legislation, that type of thing, but the co-op in most cases does not make a payment directly to the political candidate. One of the things that an example that we use, that we point out, is that if the manager of the co-op is supporting a specific political candidate and he's signing a petition supporting that candidate, he can sign it as John Doe individual, but he can't sign it as John Doe manager of XYZ co-op, because that's bringing the co-op into the political process, and in most cases you don't want that to happen. Next slide, please. Corporate opportunities. One of the things that an employee needs to understand is that if he's responsible for, let's say, purchasing all of the pickup trucks for the co-op from the local Ford dealer, he can't leverage that when he goes to buy a personal car. He can't go down to the dealership and say, as the purchasing manager for vehicles at the XYZ co-op, we buy a lot of trucks from you. What kind of a deal can you give me on a car? He can't do that type of thing. That's in violation of the ethics of the
Bill, are you still with us? Bill? Looks like his connection may have cut out. Give us 1 sec, and we'll see if we can get him back on the line. Sorry about that. We appreciate your patience, everybody. We're doing our best to get him back on the line. Seems as if his connection dropped. Give us just another minute or two. We'll see if we can get him back. Thanks. Thanks again for hanging on, everybody. We do appreciate it. I'm not sure if perhaps his phone died or his line went out at his house. Some electrical issues. We've emailed him, called him, and we're going to do our best to get him back on the line. In the meantime, if you do have any questions, please feel free to type those into the question box. We will, when we get him back on the line, we'll be sure to get those answered for you. We do have one question that came through about reputation, so we look forward to getting that answered. And we do appreciate, obviously, everybody for taking the time today to learn about compliance and for participating in our associate member webinar series. We do have a few more scheduled for later this summer. We will be announcing those shortly. They will be coming from different sectors and also covering different areas, things like rebates and the usage of mobile for your business, mobile technology. There's some good things in the pipeline. Give us a few minutes if you would, and we will do our best to get Bill back on the line. Thanks for holding. We did have a question come in about the slides being available online. Yes, they absolutely will, as will the audio of this once we get Bill back on the line and get it cleaned up. Worst case scenario, we may just have Bill come back in at a later date and record the rest of this, and we'll try to splice that together as one whole audio file. may delay getting this out to everybody, but we'll do the best we can. I do appreciate all of you for hanging on for the full time here as we work this through. Clearly, there's definitely some interest in this topic, and we definitely want to do our best to ensure that we finish this out.
Hello.
Bill.
Yes.
Hey, there you are. Awesome.
Yeah, for some reason the line went dead.
Okay.
Just as I was finishing up, hopefully.
Yeah, so we have everybody is still hanging on here. I think they were very interested. I think the last thing that we heard we were on the corporate opportunity slide.
Corporate opportunity.
Employees cannot use their position.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's where we left off.
Okay, let me flip back here. I can go through these real quickly. I didn't realize you had lost me so quickly. Yes, corporate opportunities. Where I was talking about there was that if you are the purchasing agent for all the pickup trucks for your co-op, you can't go down to the local dealer and use that as leverage for buying a personal car. You can't say, you know, as a co-op, we buy a whole lot of Ford trucks. What can you do for me in terms of the car? So that's one of the things that that you can't do. Let me look here, okay. And then the next slide is conflict of interest. You know, a lot of employees don't recognize a conflict of interest, so you have to make sure that you explain to them what it is, and the Code of Conduct does that. For an example, an accountant for a corporate or a cooperative can't keep books or financial statements for a competitor as a side business because that's in conflict with his regular job at the co-op. One of the things we impress upon our employees, if you think there's a conflict of interest, you need to ask about it before you take that second job or whatever to make sure it's not in conflict. Then the next slide was gifts, gratuities, and kickbacks. I wanted to talk there that a lot of times employees receive gifts from suppliers. The company needs to have a set value of a gift that's acceptable. Any gifts above that amount should be rejected by the employee, citing the rules of conduct. For example, sports tickets may be okay because of the nominal value of those, although sports tickets are becoming more and more expensive. But obviously that pales in comparison to an ocean cruise. An ocean cruise is probably not okay, whereas sports tickets may be. But it's up to each individual co-op to set what limits they have there. And by the same token, employees shouldn't offer gifts to customers because the customer may work for a company that has a code of conduct, and you don't want to entice them to violate their code of conduct by making that type of an offer. And finally, you know, most gifts and gratuities have some sort of string attached. You know, obviously the vendor is not giving you that out of the goodness of their heart. They're expecting you to do business with them, that type of thing. Then the next slide is discipline. Talk a little bit about that real quick. In order for a compliance program to be effective, there has to be consequences to any of those violations. And usually the severity or the frequency of the violation determines the discipline. And typically those are evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But you need to be consistent from one employee to the next. For example, if the best salesman is accused and it's proven that he was guilty of sexual conflict or sexual conduct, sexual harassment of some sort, and you don't fire him, then the guy that works out in the lot, if he's accused and found guilty of the same thing, you can't fire him either. You know, you have to treat employees the same, whether it's your best producing salesman or whether it's the guy that delivers the anhydrous to the farms. You know, one of the things that, and of course, there's various degrees of discipline. You know, you can have verbal or written warnings. If it's a verbal warning, it's typically just between the employee supervisor and the employee. If it's written, it usually goes into their personnel file. A lot of times to get an employee's attention or as a discipline, you can do suspensions without pay, you know, a couple days or a week, depending on the severity of the violation. And of course, worst case scenarios where you have to dismiss the employee. But hopefully you have a program that's effective enough that you don't have employees creating violations that would lead to that. Employees need to understand too that they may, if they knew about a violation and didn't report it and covered it up, they may be subject to some discipline also. When I talk to employees, I always impressed upon there were 3 things in my mind that would get you fired immediately. One is if you stole from the company. You know, if you're going to do that, how can we trust you in the future? Another was touching an employee in a sexual manner. Those things are just not acceptable. And then finally was lying during an investigation of a compliance incident. If you were doing a cover-up or trying to protect people, you were putting yourself, exposing yourself to some discipline, and it could be, in most cases, dismissal. So that's kind of it on the disciplinary. Then finally, the next slide, what's expected of each employee. Obviously, you want to get the point across that the employees have to understand the company's expectation and the employee's obligations to comply. And they do that by reading the code and abiding by it, and by signing that acknowledgement each year that says they have read it and that they are complying. And then finally, what's expected of management. You know, they have to understand their role in a successful compliance program. And that's to provide a direct and transparent compliant program. They have to administer the program in a fair and unbiased way. And they also have to live by that code and do the right things. So all of those things in concert, put together by the employees buying into it, by managing it, putting together a clear, concise program, all of that leads to an effective compliance program. And hopefully, you know, the real key thing is to hire the right employees. Hire employees with ethics to begin with, and you have a whole lot less problem with compliance than if you have employees who have no ethical values. So, as I say, with that, Brian, I am finished, and we'll open it up to any questions if there are any.
Sure, we do. We have a few. The first is that in terms of reputation, in the current social media / Yelp environment, people can post untrue and slanderous allegations that are often unfounded. So when the reputation is being threatened from an outside source, in your estimation, what kind of defense can be made?
You know, if you're an employee and those type of things are being said about you, probably the best thing is to be proactive. Go to your supervisor, explain that, give him or her your side of the story, and make sure that that it doesn't happen. And you know, a lot of times the best thing is just not publicly do anything. You know, you see that in the sports world a lot. People make allegations, and then all of a sudden you're on the defensive. And you know, if you do nothing about it, you know, once again, it's depending on the severity of it. But you know, sometimes no action is the best action. But you know, just be sure your employer is aware of it, and that you're aware of it, so that they're not forming their own opinions. Make sure they hear your side of the story before it gets too deep.
Great. Second question: can you think of any particular statements or thoughts that you can contribute about the situation of a worker co-op where owners, management, and employees overlap? Are there any particular things that should be kept in mind when navigating that situation, that sort of worker co-op business arrangement?
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with worker co-ops, but it would seem to me that these same rules ought to apply. Obviously, the worker co-op has a hierarchy of management and that type of thing, and while the management may be part of the worker co-op, they still have that role, that fiduciary responsibility of management, and the employees still have that fiduciary responsibility of employee to honor that code of conduct. Obviously, it's probably more important in a worker co-op because that is the product that you're selling, is the workers themselves, and they definitely need that ethical background and being pretty straightforward and not being suspect of not having any ethics.
Right on. Third question we have here is we had an employee who was demoted to a part-time position, and that position doesn't normally qualify for medical insurance. The position he came from, however, did have insurance. Can they revoke his insurance?
Well, I would hope that the co-op would have rules of who was eligible for insurance and who wasn't. Obviously management always has the capability of making exceptions, but once you start making exceptions, where does it end? If the position that employee is now in is not eligible for those types of benefits, then I think the co-op is its best is maintaining that policy and not working around it or waiving it for that particular employee, because you only set yourself up in the future for other incidences, and suddenly you have no policies or rules, because now everything is subject to is very subjective. It's subject to management prerogative.
All right. So it looks like that was the last question that we had. Unless there's any more that come in. I know we're a little bit over time now. So, Bill, do you have, unless any other questions have come in, do you have any sort of final thoughts or any sort of baseline advice for the folks on the call when they're, kind of synthesizing what you've shared today?
Oh, I think probably two or three things. One is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, hire ethical employees. Do a good job of screening your employees, making sure that they have the type of values that you as a cooperative value. Second thing is be upfront with them. Make sure they understand that there is a code of conduct and the management does have expectations. And if those expectations are not met or there are certain violations, that there will be discipline done so that they understand that their role. And then the third thing is, in order to get them to buy into it, they have to understand why the code of conduct is important to them as an employee too. And it's not just something that management's put in place to further reach management's goals. They need to understand that it's important to them as an employee, that they're, the corporation or the cooperative that they're working for is viewed as an ethical company, and that they as the employees are viewed as ethical. So, those are probably the three most important things and a compliance program and a code of conduct helps communicate that and makes it understandable to the employee.
Great. And Bill, is it okay if we share the presentation with the attendees?
Oh, by all means, yeah, please do. Great. And if anyone has any questions, my email is nsacdired@gmail.com. And my phone number is 309-530-7500. So if anybody has any questions or wants to talk further, please give me a call.
And we'll be sure to include that information as well when we share the reporting and the slides.
Great.
Great. Well, Bill, we appreciate your time. Everybody on the call, we thank you for hanging on during the brief interruption there, and thank you for sharing some time today with us. We will be announcing more webinars in the coming weeks, so please stay tuned to your Cooperative Business Journal e-newsletter that comes around. And as always, stay in touch with us. We look forward to hearing from you and from sharing any news that you guys have in the co-op sector. With that, we're going to end the webinar, and everybody have a great weekend. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for all your time. Bye.
Bye.